The wedding feast was over, the laughter of the guests had faded into the gardens like smoke, the clinking of sake cups now only a memory. What remained was silence. Not peace, but the kind of silence that claws at the skin, that thickens the air, that tells a woman her life is no longer her own. The samurai bride knelt on the tatami floor, her body still as porcelain, her head bowed so deeply her neck ached. Her white kimono trailed around her like a shroud. To the world, it was a symbol of purity, but every woman knew the truth whispered behind screens. The white kimono was the same garment used to dress the dead. A wedding was not just a union, it was a burial of the self. A single lantern burned in the corner, its flame sputtering with each draft that slithered through the paper walls. Against that fragile glow loomed a darker shadow, a sword standing upright, its hilt glinting faintly. No wedding chamber was complete without it. Its presence was deliberate, a silent declaration. The husband's word was law, and the sword was his witness. She inhaled softly, tasting cedar, smoke, and beneath it, something metallic. The faint iron tang of the blade, or perhaps of blood long past. Her heart quickened, but her body did not move. She had been trained for this: silence, stillness, surrender. From the age of 5, she had been taught that her life was not hers to shape, but her clan's. Tonight was the test. Would she prove obedient? Would she prove useful? Would she survive? Beyond the sliding doors came the sound of approaching steps. Measured. Heavy. Each footfall landed with the certainty of someone accustomed to command. The groom. Her husband. A man she barely knew, chosen not by love, but by politics. His family binding hers with her body as the rope. She had seen him perhaps 3 times before tonight, enough to know his gaze was sharp as a drawn blade, enough to know there was no softness in him. The shoji screen slid open with a hiss, and he entered. Though he wore no armor, his presence filled the room with the weight of steel. He sat opposite her, and for a long time there was only silence, the kind of silence that was not absence of sound, but presence of judgment. She dared not lift her eyes. To meet his gaze, before permission could be taken as insolence, and insolence could be punished. She remembered the stories her mother had whispered, of brides who laughed nervously on their wedding night, only to be struck across the face, of brides who spoke too boldly, their words silenced by the edge of a blade, of brides who failed to bleed, accused of dishonor, and whose bodies were discarded before dawn. The groom poured sake with deliberate precision. 3 sips, 3 times. Sansun Kudo. A ritual binding their fates. Her hands trembled as she accepted the cup, though she held it steady enough not to spill. She had practiced this countless times, but never under a gaze so piercing it felt as though he could see through her painted skin, through her silence, down to the terror she fought to keep hidden. When she lifted her veil, the lantern light struck her face, powdered white like a ghost, lips painted red in a slash that resembled blood more than beauty. She was no longer herself. She was a mask, a vessel, a symbol. Her true self was buried beneath the paint, beneath the fabric, beneath the duty pressed onto her shoulders like a millstone. The groom's eyes lingered on her in a way that made the room shrink. This was not affection. This was appraisal, property, possession. As he leaned closer, the shadows stretched across the walls like grasping hands. She could hear his breath. She could smell the sake on him. And somewhere in the chamber, the sword gleamed, a reminder of what defiance might bring. The air thickened. Her chest ached with the weight of silence. The elders had told her, do not resist, do not speak unless spoken to. Walk softly, breathe quietly. These were not words of love, but of survival. Generations of women had passed them down like sacred charms, each syllable soaked in fear. Because every bride knew the truth. The wedding night was not a promise of safety, but a trial of obedience. Some nights ended in cold duty, a wordless consummation that stripped a woman of her innocence and left her hollow. Others ended in humiliation, cruelty dressed as power, pain inflicted to remind her she was less than her husband, always less. And for some, the night ended in crimson silence, the sword drawn to prove a point that needed no words. Tonight, as the lantern flickered and shadows writhed, the bride understood why her mother's last words had been whispered with trembling lips, why her sister had clutched her hand with eyes full of warning, why so many brides never spoke of that first night again. Because this was not simply a wedding. It was an execution of self, a ritual where the girl she had been was expected to die so that the wife, silent, obedient, invisible, could be born. And as the groom's shadow swallowed her own, she knew this night was not hers. It never had been. In the dim glow of the chamber, the bride's reflection stared back at her from the surface of a polished bronze mirror. But it was not truly her. The face that gazed from the metal was not the girl who once laughed in her father's garden or whispered secrets to her sisters under the summer moon. It was something else, a mask painted by ritual, bound by duty, and cloaked in silence. Her skin, powdered white with rice flour, was no longer flesh but porcelain. Her lips, painted into a perfect crimson bow, looked less like a smile and more like a wound. Her hair, lacquered and pulled into elaborate knots, tugged at her scalp until her eyes stung. She hardly recognized the figure she saw, and perhaps that was the point. A samurai bride was not meant to carry her old self into her new life. She was meant to bury it. The white kimono clung to her shoulders, heavy and unyielding. Outsiders admired it as beautiful, the pinnacle of bridal elegance. But those who knew its true meaning felt the chill beneath the silk. White was not merely purity. White was death. It was the color worn by the departed, the shroud of the grave. On her wedding night, a bride was dressed not as a woman beginning a new life, but as a soul prepared for the afterlife. Every fold of the garment whispered, "You are no longer yourself. Tonight, you belong to him. Tonight, your body is not your own." The elders spoke of it with reverence, as if this surrender was holy. But among women, in whispers behind sliding screens, it was described more truthfully. The white robe, they would say, is the death of the girl you were. Mothers pressed the words into their daughters' ears before the ceremony, knowing once the door closed, no one could protect them. For a samurai bride, the wedding was not love's celebration. It was a transaction. A father gave his daughter not to secure her happiness, but to bind alliances, to strengthen the clan's web of loyalty. Every bow she made that day, every sip of sake, every step across the tatami floor, it was not for her. It was for the family name. And so the girl beneath the kimono disappeared. She became a vessel, a bargaining ship, a symbol. The rituals only sharpened the cruelty of it. Before entering the wedding chamber, the bride would lower her white hood, the wataboshi, hiding her face from view. The gesture was called modesty, but in truth it was erasure. She was not meant to be seen as an individual, but as a blank canvas upon which her husband would paint her new identity. Some brides compared it to walking blindfolded into the dark, knowing the path was lined with blades. Even the steps she took toward her husband were rehearsed. 3 paces, pause, bow, 3 more, pause again, like a prisoner being led to judgment. Behind her, the voices of her kin would fade. Ahead of her, the silence of the groom's household stretched like an abyss. For many brides, that silence was the cruelest part. To enter the home of a samurai lord was to step into a fortress where every wall belonged to him, every servant answered to him, and every whisper could be used against her. She was expected to smile, to serve tea, to offer obedience without hesitation. And yet, behind closed doors, she knew her worth was not measured in kindness or intelligence. It was measured in purity. The wedding night became the proving ground. If she bled, she was honored. If she did not, suspicion shadowed her. Stories spread quickly of brides accused of betrayal, their families shamed, their lives cut short. A single stain on a sheet could mean the difference between acceptance and death. It was not just intimacy that awaited her behind those doors, but judgment. And so the white kimono was more than clothing. It was a verdict waiting to be delivered, a symbol that the girl had been sacrificed so the bride could be tested. In some households, older women, aunts, midwives, attendants, hovered outside the chamber, waiting for the proof. In others, it was left to the husband alone, his word final. For the bride, there was no escape. If he chose to humiliate her, none would intervene. If he chose to strike her down, the sword in the corner would not hesitate. Yet the cruelty of the ritual was disguised by beauty. Guests admired the delicate embroidery of cranes and chrysanthemums on her sleeves. They praised the sheen of her hair, the grace of her bow. They smiled at the harmony of tradition, never acknowledging the fear hidden behind her painted lips. Because that was the unspoken law. Her silence was her virtue. To speak her dread would be to dishonor her clan. And so the bride endured, wearing her purity like a weapon pressed to her throat. As the lantern light danced across her face, she wondered if anyone had truly seen her that day. The groom saw only a pawn. The guests saw only a symbol. Even her family, who had raised her, looked at her not as their daughter, but as their offering. Perhaps no one saw her at all. Only she could feel the tremor in her chest, the pounding of her heart that betrayed the truth, that tonight she walked not into marriage but into a tomb. The white robe did not celebrate life, it buried it. And in that burial, the mask of purity became her only shield. When a samurai bride crossed the threshold of her husband's estate, she did not walk into a home, she walked into a fortress. The gates loomed like teeth, carved wood reinforced with iron, opening with the groan of chains. Servants bowed as she passed, but their eyes never warmed. They measured her, silently judging her every movement. Each bow was not a welcome, but a warning. This is not your house. These are not your people. You are a guest and a prisoner. The architecture itself conspired against her. The walls were thin, but not for intimacy. They were thin so every word could be overheard, so every slip of the tongue could echo down corridors to ears that did not belong to her. The tatami mats creaked beneath careful feet, and she quickly learned that even her footsteps were counted. The house breathed with the discipline of the warrior caste, and she, wrapped in her white kimono, was the lone unarmed figure in a place where the sword was law. In the center of the house lay the men's quarters, where the groom and his retainers spoke of war, politics, and clan affairs. She was forbidden to enter. Instead, she was led to the women's wing, a series of rooms where the air was thick with incense and silence. Here older wives, widows, and mothers of the clan watched her with cold scrutiny. They were not allies, they were gatekeepers, tasked with ensuring she remembered her role. The first night she sat in the chamber prepared for her, the lantern glow trembling against the paper walls. Her husband's armor stood on its rack like a silent sentinel, lacquered plates gleaming, helmet horns casting jagged shadows across the floor. Even without him present, the armor filled the room with menace. It was a reminder that she had not married a man, but a warrior, one trained to kill without hesitation, one whose blade was sharper than his heart. And in the corner of the bedchamber, always, was the sword. Polished, upright, within reach. A husband's authority, embodied in steel. Samurai believed the sword was the soul of the warrior, and for a bride that soul hung over her like an executioner's blade. Its presence was never accidental. It told her that while her husband might lay beside her, his sword lay closer. If she faltered, if she spoke out of turn, if she resisted, the solution stood, gleaming, merciless, unblinking. Every act in this household was ritual, but every ritual was a test. When she prepared tea, her hands had to be steady. A tremor in the cup could be interpreted as weakness, even disrespect. When she bowed, her spine had to bend just enough, too shallow and she was arrogant, too deep and she was desperate. The line between survival and disgrace was thinner than the rice paper doors. And at night, when the lanterns dimmed and silence thickened, came the true trial. The wedding chamber was no sanctuary. It was a battlefield. The groom entered not as a partner, but as a conqueror. His approach was measured, deliberate, the creak of the floorboards like drumbeats of war. The air smelled of sake and smoke, but beneath it lay something heavier, the weight of expectation, of dominance. He did not have to raise his voice, his very presence carried the threat. For many brides, this first night was not tender but brutal. The act was less about union than assertion. His chance to prove control, her chance to prove submission. Some endured in silence, clenching their teeth, burying the girl they once were beneath obedience. Others wept quietly, though tears were dangerous. To cry too loudly was to shame him, to risk anger. And there were darker tales whispered behind paper walls, of brides struck for resisting, of sheets stained with more than blood of purity, of women who never left that chamber alive. Mothers told their daughters stories of these deaths, but always in coded language. Be still as water, they would say. Do not ripple. Be soft as silk, they would advise. What they meant was, survive at any cost. And survival required silence. By day, the bride's duties expanded. Serving meals, tending to in-laws, kneeling for hours in perfect stillness as her new family gauged her worth. Each mistake carved her status deeper into stone. If she pleased them, she might be tolerated. If she failed, she would be cast aside like a tool unfit for use. In some households, cast aside meant banishment. In others, it meant something far worse. Behind the veneer of beauty, the painted screens, the blooming gardens, the soft strains of coda music, lurked constant danger. Servants carried whispers like blades, repeating her missteps. A forgotten bow could become insult. A hesitant word could be twisted into treachery. And always, the sword in the corner gleamed. Yet the greatest terror was not violence alone. It was erasure. To be stripped of her name, her laughter, her freedom until nothing remained but silence. To live not as a wife, not as a woman, but as an echo in a house that would never truly call her its own. And so she wore the white kimono-like armor, though it was no protection. She painted her face each morning into a mask, hiding the tremor of her soul. She bowed, she poured, she served. She learned to walk the tightrope of survival, each step balanced between obedience and annihilation. But in the stillness of the night, when the house slept and even the lantern flames grew weary, she sometimes let herself imagine rebellion. A hand reaching for the sword not in fear, but in defiance. A whisper that cracked the silence like thunder. A bride who did not die within her shroud, but rose from it unbound. Those were only dreams, dangerous dreams. Yet the mere fact they existed was enough to haunt her. Because deep down, she knew. The samurai household did not expect her to live as herself. It expected her to vanish. And that was why, as she lay beneath the shadow of armor and sword, she understood the truth mothers never said aloud. A bride's wedding night was not the beginning of her story, it was the end of it. The wedding night was meant to seal a bond, but in the shadows of the samurai world, it could just as easily seal a fate. Behind sliding screens and flickering lanterns, stories unfolded that no official scrolls recorded. These were not tales written in poetry or carved into temple wood. They lived only in whispers, passed from mother to daughter, servant to servant, survivor to survivor. Tales of brides who entered the chamber as wives and emerged as warnings. One such story told of a young bride from a minor clan, married into the household of a warlord whose reputation was as sharp as his blade. She was barely 15, her body trembling beneath layers of silk, her eyes wide with the terror of inexperience. When the groom found that she did not bleed, suspicion ignited like oil. He accused her of impurity, of shame, of deceit. Her pleas were muffled by the walls. By dawn, her body was carried out, wrapped in the very white kimono she had been wed in, the robe serving its other purpose, a burial shroud. Another tale spoke of a bride whose nervous laughter broke the silence of the chamber. The sound, innocent and fragile, enraged her groom. To him, laughter in that moment was defiance, mockery. He struck her across the face, her lips splitting against her teeth. The wedding chamber became an arena of humiliation. Her cries drowned beneath the scrape of his armor as he reminded her, again and again, that she was not his equal but his possession. And still more terrifying were the stories where the sword itself was unsheathed. Not always to kill, though some brides met that end, but to frighten, to carve submission into silence. Husbands drew the blade and laid it across their wives' throats as they knelt, motionless, testing their stillness. A single twitch could be taken as disobedience. A single tear could be called dishonor. The steel was not just metal, it was judgment, sharp and cold. The cruelty did not always wear the face of violence. Sometimes it came dressed in humiliation. A bride who failed to serve tea perfectly the morning after her wedding was made to bow until her forehead bled against the tatami. Another who showed hesitation when asked about her lineage was forced to kneel in the snow outside the house until her lips turned blue. These punishments were not random. They were calculated. They existed to remind every woman that her place was beneath. Always beneath. Never beside. In the women's quarters, the older wives and widows enforced this system with merciless precision. They too had endured it, and survival had hardened them into instruments of control. If a new bride cried, they silenced her. If she stumbled, they corrected her with sharp words or sharper hands. They were the guardians of the code, ensuring no woman forgot her silence. To them, sympathy was weakness. Endurance was the only virtue. And yet, beneath all this cruelty, the fear that haunted brides most was not the pain itself, but the unpredictability. No two wedding nights were the same. For some, the groom was indifferent, treating the ritual as a duty, cold and mechanical. For others, it was humiliation drawn out, cruelty disguised as dominance. And for a few, the unlucky few, it was death. This uncertainty gnawed at them, making the silence unbearable. They never knew which fate awaited them until the door slid shut. The weight of expectation was suffocating. A bride was expected to prove her purity with her body, her obedience with her silence, her worth with her survival. And yet, even if she succeeded, she was never safe. A single rumor could undo her. A servant's whispered lie, a rival's accusation, a husband's suspicion, all could strip her of honor and life. This fear seeped into every movement. Every breath became deliberate, every glance rehearsed. Brides learned to fold themselves into stillness, to bury their thoughts so deeply they could never escape. Their voices thinned until they were little more than whispers. Their laughter disappeared, their spirit locked away in a cage of ritual. Some found ways to endure. They became shadows, obeying every command, erasing themselves until there was nothing left to punish. Others hardened, turning silence into armor, their stillness a shield against cruelty. And some, though rarely spoken of, resisted. There were rumors, scattered and dangerous, of brides who met violence with violence. One tale told of a woman who, when her husband drew his sword to test her, seized the blade in her bare hands, blood flowing across the tatami. She did not cry. She did not flinch. Instead, she met his gaze with such cold defiance that he never raised a hand against her again. Another story whispered of a bride who, after years of silence, poisoned her husband's safe. Her death was certain when discovered, but in that act, she reclaimed a sliver of power. These stories, half truth, half legend, traveled like secret fire among women. They were never told in the open, but in hushed corners, behind closed doors, they reminded brides that even within the cage, sparks of rebellion could exist. Still, such defiance was the exception, not the rule. For most, survival demanded surrender. The silence of the wedding chamber was more than absence of sound. It was a weapon. The groom wielded it to test her. The household reinforced it to cage her, and society sanctified it to erase her. Brides learned that to break the silence was to invite ruin, so they folded their voices into themselves, locking away words that would never be spoken. Their laughter withered, their songs died in their throats, and the girl they had been became a ghost inside their own skin. The shadows of violence lingered not only in the chamber, but in memory. A bride might survive her first night, but she carried the imprint forever. The weight of the sword in the corner, the sting of humiliation, the suffocating silence. Years later, even as a matron, even as a mother, she might still wake in the dark with her heart pounding, her body trembling, remembering the terror of that first night. And yet, society cloaked this cruelty in beauty. Poets wrote of the elegance of the bride's white kimono, never of the tears that stained it. Artists painted wedding processions with fans and lanterns, never the shadows behind the doors. The cruelty lived only in whispers, because to speak it aloud was to betray the code, and betrayal for a woman was unforgivable. It is in these shadows that the true horror of the samurai wedding night lay, not only in the violence that sometimes erupted, but in the silence that always smothered, a silence so complete it swallowed truth, buried pain, and erased the voices of countless women whose names we will never know. And this is why, when a bride bowed before the groom, when she lowered her veil, when she stepped into that chamber where the sword gleamed in the corner, her heart pounded not with anticipation, but with dread. She was not stepping into marriage. She was stepping into a trial by silence, a night where obedience was demanded, fear was tested, and survival was never guaranteed. The shadows of violence stretched far beyond the chamber walls. They seeped into generations, shaping mothers who whispered warnings, sisters who trembled on their own wedding nights, daughters who learned from the cradle that silence was safety. These shadows were not broken easily. They linger still, haunting the memory of an era where honor was carved into men's swords, and women's fear was the mortar that held households together. And so the stories continued, whispered in the dark, carried across centuries, stories of brides who survived, of brides who broke, of brides who vanished. Stories that remind us why samurai brides did not look upon their wedding night with joy, but with fear. Fear as heavy as the blade in the corner. Fear that followed them long after the lanterns went dark. Silence became the bride's inheritance. It was not granted to her on her wedding night, it was forced into her veins from the moment the door slid shut and the sword gleamed in the corner. Every ritual that followed pressed silence deeper into her skin until it became indistinguishable from her own breath. She learned quickly that words were weapons, but not for her. Words belonged to men, to lords, to retainers who carried messages sealed with crests. For women, words were dangers. A misplaced sentence could ruin her, an overheard whisper could condemn her. And so silence became ritual, drilled into her body until her tongue ached with the weight of what it could never say. Her mother had warned her with coded fragments before the ceremony. Do not ripple the water. Be the shadow, not the flame. Bend like bamboo, never break. Each phrase was a mask for harsher truths. Your voice can kill you. Your laughter can shame you. Your disobedience can erase you. In the women's wing, silence was enforced like scripture. Conversations never lingered. Questions were dangerous. Laughter was rare and sharp, cut short if footsteps echoed down the corridor. Servants carried whispers to the men of the house, who judged every syllable like evidence. The older women, mothers-in-law, widows, attendants, corrected the young with a gaze colder than steel. If a bride cried, they scolded her. If she trembled, they silenced her. Weep in your heart, they said, but never let it reach your lips. The silence of the women's quarters was a cage, but it was also an endless rehearsal for the silence of the chamber. Each night, when she knelt on the tatami beside the sword and the armor, she knew she was not just submitting to her husband. She was submitting to the entire system that demanded her voicelessness. Her lowered eyes were not her choice. They were the legacy of countless brides before her, each one pressed into silence until her very name dissolved. The rituals deepened the erasure. The hood, wataboshi, lowered to cover her face, teaching her she was not meant to be seen. The bows, each practiced angle rehearsed to perfection, teaching her she was not meant to stand tall. The sake cups, passed between her and her husband, teaching her that union meant swallowing fear without protest. Even daily life turned into ritualized silence. When she poured tea, her hands could not tremble. When she walked, her feet could not creak against the mats. When she served her husband, her gaze could not linger too long or avoid him too sharply. Every action was a performance of obedience, a test where failure brought punishment. Quote, if any man with doubt, quote, even if he be wary, the sight of his plate should remove it. And yet, silence was never safety. A single rumor, a servant whispering that she sighed too loudly, that her bow was too shallow, that she hesitated when her husband called, could unravel everything. Punishments came swiftly, kneeling for hours until her knees bled, fasting for days in shame, or, in the cruelest houses, the cold press of steel against her throat to remind her of her place. The silence was more suffocating than the threat of violence itself, because it erased her from the world even as she lived in it. To survive, she had to bury her thoughts so deeply that sometimes she feared she would never find them again. She learned to smile with lips that did not feel joy, to bow with a spine that longed to straighten, to walk with steps that led only deeper into her own erasure. Her silence was expected at all times, at meals, at ceremonies, even in childbirth, when cries were deemed shameful. To be loud was to dishonor the household. To scream was to disgrace her family. Even pain had to be endured quietly, swallowed like poison. This was why samurai brides feared their wedding nights, because the silence that began there did not end in the morning. It followed them into every hour of their lives until it became their identity. And yet, beneath the suffocating hush, something stirred. Not rebellion, not yet, but awareness. The realization that silence was not just demanded, but feared. Men kept women silent, not only to erase them, but because they knew. Words, once spoken, could wound deeper than blades. Stories, once told, could spread further than armies. Every bride felt it, though few dared to admit it. The silence was a prison, but it was also pressure. And pressure, when pushed long enough, always waits for the moment to break. For now, the silence held. Brides bowed, served, endured, but in the shadows the weight of all that unsaid began to gather, like storm clouds behind paper walls. And when it broke, it would not break softly. Every samurai bride entered her wedding chamber knowing the silence would swallow her. But not every bride stayed swallowed. Whispers told of one night, not in scrolls, not in poems, but in the hushed confessions of servants who dared not attach their names. A bride, barely 16, was led into her husband's house, her kimono trailing like a shroud. She bowed, she poured tea, she lowered her eyes. She performed the ritual as perfectly as any before her, and yet something in her silence was different. This was in story. Whispers told of one night, 100. When her husband entered the chamber, his armor still smelling of horse sweat and iron, he expected obedience, he expected fear, he expected silence that bent, cracked, and yielded. What he found instead was silence sharpened like a blade. The ritual began as always. He sat, she knelt. He poured the sake, she lifted the cup with trembling hands. But when she lowered her veil and revealed her face, her gaze lifted for just a breath too long. A flicker of defiance, quick as a lightning strike. A glance that said, I see you. I am not blind. I know what waits behind your sword. It was dangerous, reckless even. Men had killed for less, but in that moment, something shifted. He did not strike her. He did not unsheath his blade. He paused. Because for the first time, the silence did not belong to him. It belonged to her. From that night, the whispers spread. Some claimed she endured humiliation and pain, but never bowed her spirit. Others swore she fought back, that when the sword was drawn, she seized it with bare hands, blood pouring over her white sleeves, her eyes unflinching. No one knew which version was true. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. But the story itself became more dangerous than the act. Because once told, it could not be contained. Other brides began to hear it. In the kitchens, in the women's wing, in the stolen breaths between duties. They repeated the tale, with awe, with envy, with trembling hope. A bride who did not die within her silence. A bride who met the blade and refused to vanish. The men dismissed it as gossip, but in their dismissal lay fear. They knew that silence was their strongest weapon. And now silence itself carried rumor, carried rebellion. This was the turning point. Not the fall of a single household, not the spilling of blood in one chamber, but the shift of perception. The realization that silence was not just obedience. Silence could be weaponized. It could be sharpened. It could be turned back on them. From that moment, the story of the samurai bride was no longer only one of fear. It was also one of possibility. A possibility that somewhere behind lowered eyes, a spark still burned. That behind the white kimono, beneath the weight of ritual, within the silence meant to erase them, brides carried something their husbands could never touch. Endurance, defiance, strength that waited. The silence was not broken that night, but it cracked. And once a crack appears, no wall, no fortress, no household can remain unbroken forever. For generations, the story of the samurai bride was told in whispers. A story of silence, of fear, of obedience, sharpened into ritual. But buried within those whispers was another story, one that did not fit neatly into the crests of clans or the codes of men, one that lived only in fragments, in the quiet resilience of women who were never meant to be remembered. The men believed silence broke women. What they did not see was how silence shaped them instead. Every bride who entered the chamber learned to bow, to lower her eyes, to move without sound. But beneath the mask of obedience, something else stirred. Endurance. The kind that survives humiliation, survives threat, survives the blade gleaming in the corner. The kind of strength that does not roar but waits, patient as stone, until its moment comes. Some wielded silence like a shield. They endured, outlasting cruelty by becoming immovable. They learned to store their rage, their grief, their memories in places no man could reach. When their husbands spoke of alliances, of war, of betrayal, they listened, they remembered. And years later, when the tide of power shifted, it was often these women who whispered at the right moment, who guided sons and grandsons with knowledge no man suspected they possessed. Their silence had not been submission, it had been strategy. Others turned silence into rebellion, a glance held too long, a smile withheld, a teacup poured with hands that never trembled, no matter how much a husband tried to shake them. These were small acts, invisible to most, but to the women who performed them, they were victories, proof that the self had not been entirely erased. And then there were the rare, breathtaking acts of defiance that lived on in legend. Whispers spoke of a bride who, on her first night, was commanded to kneel until her body ached. When her husband drew his blade to test her stillness, she leaned forward until the steel pressed against her skin. "If I bleed," she whispered, "let it be proof I am alive, not a ghost." Her words could have sealed her death. Instead, her defiance unsettled him. He sheathed the blade and never raised it to her again. Another tale told of a woman married into a cruel household, her husband known for humiliating his wives. Night after night she endured in silence, until one winter evening she placed a cup of sake before him, laced with foxglove. He drank, laughed, then fell silent forever. They buried her alive for it, the story claimed, but her name became a ghost that haunted kitchens and corridors, whispered by other brides as a prayer of courage. She did not die silently. Even in less dramatic acts, strength revealed itself. Women who raised children in households where their own voices were suppressed taught those children cunning, resilience, compassion. Sons who would become generals learned discipline not only from their father's swords, but from their mother's silences. Daughters learned how to endure, and sometimes how to resist. The legacy of these brides lived not in scrolls or monuments, but in the very fabric of the next generation. Because what the samurai could never understand was this: you can silence a woman's voice, but you cannot silence what she sees, and women see everything. Behind lowered eyes, brides watched husbands falter. They saw retainers betray, saw alliances crumble, saw the cracks in the armor of men who claimed to be invincible. Their silence was not ignorance. It was record-keeping. It was survival. It was power, waiting for the right moment to be spoken, or to be acted upon. Some of these women outlived their husbands, becoming matriarchs of their households. In widowhood, their silence often lifted, and the words they had carried for decades spilled into the open. Secrets, strategies, knowledge that shifted the balance of families. They had been underestimated for too long, and in that underestimation lay their victory. Others never spoke, but their silence itself became legend. The quiet endurance of a bride who bore cruelty without breaking, who raised children with dignity despite humiliation, who carried herself like stone in the storm, inspired those who came after. Not every victory was rebellion. Sometimes the greatest strength was simply to survive in a world designed to erase you. And yet, survival itself was rebellion, as the samurai believed they had power over life and death. They dressed their brides in white, reminding them of burial. They placed swords in the corner, reminding them of threat. They cloaked households in silence, reminding them of obedience. And still, women endured. Still, their stories slipped through. Still, whispers traveled, defiance spread, resilience grew. The rituals had meant to erase them. Instead, they gave them shape. The mask of purity, meant to bury the girl, became the face of a woman who knew how to endure. The white kimono, meant as a shroud, became the cloth of survivors. The silence, meant as submission, became the soil in which hidden strength took root. This is why the story of the samurai bride does not end only in fear. It ends in something deeper. The revelation that strength can bloom even in the most suffocating silence. That resilience can outlast cruelty. That defiance can live on, whispered across centuries, carried in the bones of daughters who refused to vanish. And so the image lingers, a bride kneeling beneath the lantern's glow, her head bowed, her lips closed, the sword gleaming in the corner. To her husband she looks obedient, to her household she looks erased. But within her silence burns something unseen, endurance sharper than steel, patience deeper than any well, strength that cannot be killed. She will not scream, she will not strike, she will not break, but she will survive. And survival in a world built on her silence is the loudest defiance of all. What does it mean to live your life in silence? To bow so often your spine bends with memory, to bury your voice so deeply you begin to forget its sound, to smile when your heart trembles with dread. For the samurai bride, silence was never a choice. It was inheritance. It was ritual. It was survival. And yet, when we step back and look at it now, across centuries, we see something deeper. We see that silence, imposed as a weapon, became a mirror. It reflected not only the cruelty of the samurai code, but also the resilience of the women forced to live within it. Because silence, though heavy, does not erase humanity. Every bride who entered the wedding chamber carried with her the pulse of a human heart, the warmth of her childhood laughter, the tenderness of her mother's hand when she braided her hair. The rituals tried to strip these things away, the paint, the kimono, the veil. Each layer told her she was no longer herself, that she existed only for her husband, only for the household, only for obedience. But beneath all that, she remained human, and the human spirit, even when pressed into silence, refuses to disappear. That is the haunting truth. These women endured nights of fear, mornings of humiliation, years of erasure. They were told their worth was bound to purity, that their lives were tied to their husband's honor, that their silence was their only virtue. And still, they raised children, managed households, remembered secrets, passed on wisdom. Still, they survived long enough that their whispers, though quiet, reached us here. There is something unbearably moving in that. To imagine a girl of 15, dressed as if for burial, entering a house that was not her own, knowing she could be broken that very night, and yet she walked anyway. She bowed, she poured, she endured. She carved a life out of silence, not because she chose it, but because she had no other choice. And somehow, she kept enough of herself alive that her daughters and granddaughters could inherit not only her fear, but her endurance. When we think of samurai, we think of men, of swords, of battles, of codes of honor. But what of the women who fought wars without armor, whose battlegrounds were wedding chambers and corridors where words could kill? Their battles left no monuments, but their survival left something more enduring, a lesson about the human spirit's refusal to vanish. Because silence, as crushing as it was, did not destroy them. It reshaped them. It forced them into corners where they found ways to hold on, to endure, to defy quietly, to resist in ways that could not always be seen. And that is its own kind of strength. A strength not celebrated in chronicles, but carried in bones, in whispers, in the way resilience passes silently from one generation to the next. The emotional weight lies in what was lost and what was preserved. What was lost? Laughter, voices, names of women whose stories never made it into official histories, the freedom to speak without fear, to love without ritual, to live without silence pressing against every breath. What was preserved? Endurance, memory, the hidden strength of women who refused, even in their erasure, to vanish completely. And isn't that the most haunting part? That the very silence meant to erase them became the thing that speaks loudest to us now? When we read of these rituals, when we imagine the bride in her white shroud kneeling beneath the shadow of a sword, we do not see weakness, we see resilience. We feel the weight of her fear, but also the persistence of her survival. It forces us to ask, what is strength? Is it the swing of a blade? The shout of a war cry? Or is it the quiet endurance of a girl who sits in stillness, refusing to break even when the world demands her silence? There is a moral ache in this story, because it reminds us of how easily power erases voices, how tradition can be weaponized, how silence can be imposed on the most vulnerable. But there is also a thread of hope, fragile but unbreakable, because even in the most suffocating silence, these women carried something that survived. And perhaps that is why their story matters so much now. We are not meant to look at them with pity, as though they were only victims. We are meant to see them as survivors, as women who bore the weight of silence and transformed it into something else: legacy, endurance, hidden strength. The image lingers, a bride kneeling in white, her lips closed, her eyes lowered. To her husband, she is silent. To history, she is forgotten. But to us, looking back, her silence is not empty. It is full. Full of all the things she was never allowed to say, full of all the things she carried within her, full of a strength that still speaks even centuries later. And so we end, not with the blade, not with the shroud, not with the silence itself, but with what silence could not destroy. The resilience of the human spirit, the defiance that endures in whispers, the haunting truth that even in erasure voices survive. That is why samurai brides feared their wedding nights, but it is also why we remember them. Night falls on the samurai household. The lanterns gutter, the corridors fall still, and behind the sliding doors, a bride kneels in silence, her shadow swallowed by the gleam of a sword. For centuries, this was the image that defined her. Not her name, not her laughter, not her voice, but her silence. It is tempting, when looking back, to see only the cruelty. The shrouds disguised as kimonos, the swords displayed as warnings, the rituals that carved obedience into every gesture. We imagine the girl of 15, dressed as though for burial, walking into a chamber she may never walk out of, her body trembling beneath paint and silk. And yes, this cruelty is real. It must be seen for what it was. A system that demanded erasure, a silence that suffocated generations. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper truth. Because the story of the samurai bride is not only a story of silence, it is a story of survival. Every whisper we uncovered, of brides who endured humiliation without breaking, of widows who outlived their husbands and revealed secrets, of mothers who pressed coded wisdom into their daughters' ears, tells us something that no sword could erase. That even within the suffocating rituals, even beneath the mask of purity, even inside the silence, strength endured. And that is what lingers. Think of the girl on her wedding night, bowing until her spine ached, her lips sealed, her fear smothered beneath ritual. She should have disappeared, her voice should have been erased, but somewhere inside she preserved herself, in memory, in endurance, in silence that was not empty but alive. She carried that hidden ember forward. She passed it in whispers, in glances, in the quiet teaching of her daughters. And across centuries, that ember survived. It is why we can speak of her now. That ember, fragile, trembling but unbroken, is the true legacy of the samurai bride. It forces us to ask, what do we remember? Do we remember the swords and the codes, the warriors and their victories? Or do we remember the women who endured those codes, whose victories were measured not in blood spilled, but in survival carved quietly against impossible odds? History has tried to bury them in silence, but silence has an echo. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear it. The echo of brides who refused to vanish, the echo of resilience humming beneath erasure, the echo of survival louder than any war drum. That is why this story grips us, because it is not only history, it is reflection, it is a mirror. Even today, how often are voices still pressed into silence? How often are women still measured by obedience, by purity, by roles imposed upon them rather than chosen? The rituals may look different now, the swords may not gleam in the corners of rooms, but the weight of silence demanded, expected, enforced, lingers in ways both subtle and sharp. To look back at the samurai bride is to confront not just their fear, but our own inheritance of silence. It asks us, what voices are we still not hearing? What truths are still buried in whispers? And yet, it also offers hope. Because if women could endure then, in chambers where death was always close, where silence was suffocating, where survival itself was rebellion, then resilience is deeper, stronger, more enduring than cruelty ever could be. Picture again the image, the bride in white, kneeling beneath the lantern's flicker, the sword glinting in the corner. To her husband she looks erased, to her household she looks obedient, But now we know better. Now we see what they could not. We see the ember burning within her silence. We see the strength hidden behind her lowered eyes. We see not a victim, but a survivor. And that changes everything. Because once you see her that way, you cannot unsee her. You cannot return to believing silence is weakness. You cannot mistake obedience for absence. You cannot forget that resilience often hides in the quietest places. This is the haunting gift of her story. It does not end in despair. It does not end in burial. It ends in recognition. Recognition of strength that history tried to erase but could not. Recognition of women whose silence was never emptiness, but endurance. Recognition that even in the darkest chambers, humanity survives. And so we end where we began, with silence, but no longer the suffocating silence of fear. Now, it is a silence heavy with meaning, a silence that speaks louder than words, a silence that remembers. The lantern goes out, the chamber falls dark. The sword gleams faintly in the moonlight, but it no longer defines the story. What defines it is the bride herself, her endurance, her hidden strength, her survival. And that survival whispers still. It whispers through time, through generations, through history's attempt to erase. It whispers in the way resilience is passed down silently, from mother to daughter, from sister to sister, from woman to woman. It whispers in our bones when we hear stories of survival, when we feel the ache of silence and the power of endurance. The samurai bride feared her wedding night because she knew what awaited her. Silence, erasure, threat. But we remember her not for her fear, but for what she carried through it, the ember that no sword could extinguish. And as long as that ember is remembered, she is never truly silent. Check the next video for another tale that would blow your mind.